This lecture is going to cover in-text citations and APA formatting, and also some suggestions for how to utilize evidence. So in-text citations are really important because they help establish the credibility of the writer, and they also show respect for somebody else's intellectual property. They allow you to avoid plagiarism and things like that. And the purpose of in-text citations are to help your reader located a cited source in the references page. So basically what you're giving the reader is just enough information to cross-reference the citation and match the entry with the references page. So you want to cite a source within the text when you mention a specific study, if you cite statistics from the study, if you paraphrase an author's ideas, or if you use the direct quote. You do need the page numbers if you use a direct quote, but otherwise you won't include page numbers. So generally what you need, and again, the exception is a direct quote, but you shouldn't really be using those. Generally what you need in the in-text citation is the author's last name and the date of publication in parentheses. So that's kind of the most simple format. Note, you do not include the author's first name. You don't include the author's university. You don't include the title of the article. The only thing that goes in there is the author's last names and the date of publication. Okay, so again, do not list the author's full name, affiliation, the full title of the article or the journal. In the in-text citations, you don't need to distinguish between the types of sources. So within the text, you don't need to identify, was it a book or a journal article or other source. One kind of exception or thing to think about is if you have an entire paragraph that is all about the same citation, you can cite the authors and the year the first time you mention the reference, and make it clear throughout the paragraph that you are still referring to the same article. So you could say things like, this article also found that, or in addition, they found, to make it clear that you're all talking about the same article, and that way you don't have to cite it every single sentence. But if you're referring to more than one article within a paragraph, you need to be citing each time. So if you have summarized or paraphrased, which again, this is the vast majority of the citations you'll be making, there's two ways you can do it. The more common one is after the idea. And so if you do it after the idea, you cite the last name and the year in parentheses. So here's an example. This first example, though feminist studies focus solely on women's experiences, they err by collectively perpetuating the masculine-centered impressions. This is a paraphrase of what the article stated, and so we've cited the author's last name and the year. Another alternative, and this is less common, is to use the author's last name within the sentence and then put the year in parentheses. And so this example says history of warfare has been significantly revised by Wright and Tate, and then the year immediately after. So be sure that if you use the author's name in the sentence, the year doesn't go at the end of the sentence. It goes immediately after. In contrast, if you are citing both the author's name and the year, you wait until the end of the sentence. Okay, if you are using a direct quote, and you should use these sparingly, if at all, you can either do the same format, so the author's name in the sentence, year in parentheses immediately after, and then the page number at the end of the quote, or you can put it all in quotations at the end of the sentence. A couple of kind of special cases or exceptions. If you have two or more works, so if you're citing two studies, so you might say something like multiple studies have found evidence that shyness is bad. You organize by the first author's last name, and then separate with a semicolon. So this is our first article, this is our second article. If you've got a work by two authors, in the text, you use the word and between the last names. If you're citing in parentheses, you use an ampersand in between the last names. If you have a work with three or more authors, you use et al., which means and others. Now, in Older styles of APA, you used to cite all the authors the first time and use et al. Only after the first citation, but new to APA 7, you always use et al. Even in the first citation. So here's an example of how to use it in text. You could also say something like Harklau and colleagues, and then put the year identified that, blah, blah, blah. If you do it in parentheses, first author's last name, et al., period. So it's ET space AL period, and then the comma goes after the all, the year. Oops. Okay. We already talked about the references list, but I'm just going to briefly review it. Again, you want to make sure when you are done with your paper or a paper to cross-reference your references list and confirm that your references list includes any source that you have cited in the paper and doesn't include sources that have not been cited in the text. So the references list is only sources that have been cited in the text. And again, we already saw examples of this. You should center the title references at the top of the page. Everything should be double spaced. The first line is flushed to the left, and then all subsequent lines are indented, and you alphabetize by the author's last name. Okay, so an opportunity to try this yourself. I want you to look at these citations, these in-text citations, pause the video, go through and make any APA error corrections that you see. And actually there are references citations as well as in-text citations. All right, and here is the answer key. So you can pause the video, go through and compare your answers. Here's another set to try, again, looking for errors. So again, you can pause the video and go through and correct the errors in this. And then this is the answer key for that second set. Okay, so when you are working with evidence, once you've read your articles and you have to figure out how to cite them, you want to write as close to fact as possible. So facts are a statement that can be proven with empirical evidence. You want to avoid beliefs and opinions and preferences, things that are unprovable. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not true, but we cannot prove them. And so they shouldn't be used to try to convince the reader. And so the goal here with the kind of paper you're writing is to use evidence to prove that these things are true. If you don't have evidence, but you want to kind of make the argument that something could be happening, you might use words like might or may to make it clear that we don't actually have the evidence to support it. And so you want to make sure you're kind of asking questions to be sure that you are using the evidence to support your statement. And so this is another example for you to kind of try for yourself. Pause the video and think about what questions you might use to challenge these assumptions. So how could you identify a statement of fact versus a belief or an opinion or preference? So if we look at the statement, big companies are ruining the environment, think about what kind of questions you might ask to identify, is there actually evidence for this or is this an opinion? Okay, so these are some examples of the kinds of questions you might ask. So for the first one, what is a ruined environment? What does it look like? Do all big companies do this? Second one, travel is educational. What does it teach you? What type of travel? What proof do we have of this? Number three, our brand of cigarette is tar-free. Do other brands have tar? Why is tar bad? What evidence is there that it is actually tar-free? Number four, the right will prevail. What is right? Five, a long run is good for you. In what way? Physical health, emotional health. So these kinds of statements, if you're going to make them, you need to make sure that you have evidence to back them up. Okay. Two basic types of reasoning that you might use, and we often don't think about kind of the logic behind our rationale, but it's really important too, especially when you're making an argument. We want to be using inductive reasoning, where we have evidence, and that leads to a general conclusion. So as we're developing our thesis, especially during the pre-research stage, we want to use the evidence to support a general conclusion. Deductive reasoning, we go from general ideas to parts or pieces of evidence. So we might use deductive reasoning to present our thesis and break it into supporting evidence. And so you need to kind of be able to switch back and forth. Are you making general conclusions from evidence, or using some kind of general ideas to kind of break up the evidence that you've got? Another important thing to think about as you're reading research is in looking at sources is to think about how well do they support their own arguments. Okay, so there's a number of potential kind of mistakes that they might make that you want to be looking for. And we see this more, I think the peer review process helps address some of these things, but you'll definitely see these kinds of mistakes in more popular sources. So emotionally loaded terms uses emotions instead of evidence, right? This is terrible without any actual evidence for why it might be terrible. The bandwagon fallacy, the argument is basically because everyone else does it, you should too. Faulty cause and effect is making connections with correlational evidence, right? We know that correlation doesn't lead to causation, and we don't have the evidence to support that. So for example, this graph here demonstrates that. So increases in organic food sales seem to be rising, this is based on the year, at the same rate as increases in rates of autism diagnoses. So if we made the faulty cause and effect assumption, we could come to the conclusion that organic foods cause autism. Obviously, we know that they don't, but there is a correlation there, even though it's not actually cause and effect. And so we need to be really careful not making causal conclusions based on correlations. Either or and false dichotomy. So either or is making it sound like it has to be one or the other. So for example, making a statement, either aggression comes from nature or from nurture. Well, aggression could be a result of both of those things or an interaction between them. False dichotomy is similar, you have to pick one or the other. Hasty generalizations, basically what's true for one group doesn't necessarily mean that it's true for another. So making general assumptions that could be overgeneralized. So you definitely might find these kinds of mistakes in popular sources, but it's also possible you'll find them in academic sources. And you want to be really aware and cautious of claims like these and be careful that you're not making them as well. Okay, so these are a couple of examples that you can test out for yourself. Think about what kind of false claims or problematic claims are being made in each one of these statements. Okay, and then you can see I've got the answer key here. So although professors either suck the life out of everything or make learning a positive experience, students believe college is a time of personal growth and that they were able to experience new things, new worlds, and learn more about themselves. Either professors suck the life out of everything or make college a learning experience. There's probably some in between. At 60, Ethel retires with investments and savings worth more than $500,000. She has nothing to worry about for the rest of her life. There's a lot of things that could go wrong that could add up to that. Hasty generalization. Number 3, she either worked hard for her money or she's just plain lucky. Again, there could be some in between. Number 4, English majors are poor mathematicians. Not all English majors are, maybe not even most of them. So be aware and cautious of these kinds of mistakes in logic.